"Get out of my seat." She didn't whisper it. She announced it loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. Tiffany Miller stood over the old man in 2A arms, crossed lip curled like she was removing a piece of trash someone had left behind. "This is first class. You clearly don't belong here." The passengers around them went quiet. A few looked away. One pulled out a phone and the old man worn coat, old shoes, 82 years of life on his face, just looked up at her without flinching. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't beg. He simply said, "Are you sure that's what you want to do?" She called security anyway, and that quiet question would cost them everything. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The boarding gate for Flight 116 New York to London was exactly the kind of place where money announced itself before a single word was spoken. The terminal gleamed, the carpet was thick. The lounge beyond the frosted glass doors smelled like fresh espresso and leather, and the passengers who moved through it carried themselves the way people do when they've never once had to wonder whether they belonged somewhere. Augustus King did not carry himself that way. He moved slowly the way a man does when his knees have earned their complaints over 8 decades of use. His coat was a dark wool thing, heavy and slightly too large, the kind of coat that had been good once and was still good, just not fashionable. His shoes were plain. His carry-on bag was small, one soft-sided case with a broken zipper pull that he'd replaced with a twist of wire. He wore no watch anyone would notice. No jewelry, no logo, nothing that would tell you a single thing about who he was. The gate agent barely glanced at his boarding pass before waving him through. Augustus found his way down the jet bridge and stepped aboard the aircraft with the quiet confidence of a man who had done this particular thing, walked into a room where he was underestimated more times than he could count. He found seat 2, the window seat in the first row of first class, settled himself in, placed his bag in the overhead bin with some effort, and sat down. He folded his hands on his lap. He looked out the window at the gray morning sky. He breathed. He was not thinking about the flight. He was thinking about his daughter Camille, who had called him 3 days ago from London. Her voice doing that careful thing it did when she was trying not to sound worried. She was fine, she said. The new gallery opening was fine. Everything was fine. But Augustus had learned over 82 years that when the people he loved said everything was fine, in that particular tone, he needed to go see for himself. So he had packed his small bag, booked his seat, and now here he was in 2A, watching the ground crew move around the tarmac below. He did not notice the flight attendant at first. He became aware of her. The way you become aware of a change in temperature gradually and then all at once. Her name tag said Tiffany Miller. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, professionally dressed with the kind of practiced smile that service industry workers develop like a second language. But the smile she was wearing as she approached him was not the professional one. It was something tighter, something that had already made a decision before she even opened her mouth. "Excuse me," she said. Augustus looked up from the window. "Can I help you find your seat?" He studied her for a moment. "I'm in my seat," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never needed to rush his words to be heard. Tiffany's smile tightened another degree. "This is seat 2A, first class." "Yes," Augustus said. "I know, sir." She said the word the way people sometimes say it when they don't mean it as a courtesy at all. "This section is reserved for first-class ticketed passengers." "I have a first-class ticket," he said simply. She held out her hand. "I'm going to need to see it around them." The cabin was filling up. Other passengers were moving past, glancing over, that particular social awareness kicking in. The awareness that something uncomfortable was happening and the instinct that came with it to look and then look away. A businessman in 2B had already put his headphones on. A woman across the aisle pretended to study her phone. Augustus reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a small paper envelope, the kind airlines used to use before everything went digital. He handed it to Tiffany without comment. She opened it. She looked at the ticket. She looked at him. She looked at the ticket again, and something crossed her face in that moment. Something that was not confusion, but rather the expression of a person who has already decided on an outcome and is now irritated that the facts are not cooperating with it. "Where did you get this?" she asked. The cabin went a little quieter. Not silent, There was still the sound of bags being stowed and the overhead announcement cycling through its pre-aperture loop, but the people within earshot had gone still in that way. That meant they were listening. Augustus tilted his head very slightly. I purchased it, he said, like most people purchase airline tickets. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Not angry, not loud, just clear. Sir, my name say, he said, is Augustus King. I am in seat 2A for which I have a valid first-class ticket. I intend to fly to London. If you have a specific concern, I'd encourage you to raise it with your supervisor. For a moment, Tiffany Miller stood very still. The boarding process had slowed. People were watching now, not pretending not to. A young woman in the third row had her phone out and was filming, though whether she was filming with sympathy or sport, it was hard to say. Then Tiffany said quietly but firmly, "You don't belong here." The words landed in the cabin like something dropped from a height. Clear. Unmistakable. Not a policy concern, not a ticket verification, just those 4 words spoken to an old black man in a worn coat sitting in a first-class seat on a luxury aircraft. The woman with the phone kept filming. The businessman in 2B took off one headphone. Augustus King looked at Tiffany Miller for a long moment. His expression did not change. His voice when he spoke was almost gentle. "Are you sure that's what you want to do?" She called for security. It took less than 4 minutes for 2 airport security officers to appear at the front of the cabin. They were young, both of them, and they had the slightly uncomfortable look of people who have been called to a situation they haven't been fully briefed on. One of them, the taller one, spoke first. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." "On what grounds?" Augustus asked. "There's been a complaint." "By whom regarding what?" The officer glanced at Tiffany, who stood slightly behind him now, arms crossed. "The flight attendant has indicated." "The flight attendant," Augustus said, "told me I don't belong in the seat for which I hold a valid ticket. I'd like to know what the specific complaint is." The officer shifted his weight. "Sir, if you could just I will not just," Augustus said, still calm, still quiet, but there was something in his voice now. Not anger, but something beneath anger, something older and more patient and therefore more dangerous. "I am 82 years old. I have a first-class ticket. I am seated in the correct seat. I have broken no rule. I have raised my voice to no one. And I am asking you specifically on what grounds you are asking me to leave this aircraft." The cabin was fully still now. Even the overhead announcement had cycled off. The second officer leaned toward the first and said something low. And the first officer said also low, "I know, but she's crew." "She's crew," Augustus repeated his hearing, apparently sharper than they'd counted on. "And I am a passenger with a confirmed ticket in a confirmed seat. I'd like to speak with the captain." That request went nowhere. The captain did not appear. What appeared instead 3 minutes later was a ground supervisor, a man in his 40s named Derek Walsh with the look of someone who had spent 20 years managing situations he'd rather not be managing. He assessed the scene quickly. Old man, 2 security officers, flight attendant, filming passenger, very attentive cabin. "Mr." He looked at the ticket Tiffany had apparently handed him. "Mr. King, I'm Derek Walsh, ground operations supervisor. Can we step off the plane and talk?" "There's nothing to discuss off the plane," Augustus said. "Everything that needs to be said can be said here." Derek Walsh lowered his voice. "Sir, I understand there's been a misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding," Augustus said. "She told me I don't belong here." "That's not a misunderstanding. That's a statement. Sir, I'm asking you as calmly as I can to please come with us so we can get this sorted." "I'm not moving," Augustus said. The standoff held for another 30 seconds. Then Derek Walsh made a decision, the wrong decision as it would turn out, and nodded once at the security officers. They reached for Augustus's arms. He did not fight them. He stood up on his own slowly, deliberately, and he looked at each of them in turn, the officers, Derek Walsh, Tiffany Miller. He looked around the cabin at the faces watching him. He was very still, very quiet, and then he walked under his own power down the aisle and off the plane. No one stopped it. A few people looked uncomfortable. The young woman filming lowered her phone after he passed. The businessman in 2B put his headphone back on, and Tiffany Miller straightened her jacket and moved to prepare the cabin for departure. What happened next took place on the jetway out of sight of the passengers. But it was the moment that would later be described in financial newspapers, courtrooms, and business school case studies as the single most expensive 60 seconds in airline history. Augustus King stood on the jetway floor. His bag was at his feet. His ticket was still in his hand. Derek Walsh was speaking at him about policies and procedures and the regrettable nature of the situation. And Augustus was not listening to a single word of it. He was not angry. He was not humiliated. At least not in the way Derek Walsh hoped he might be. The small, manageable kind of humiliation that makes people go away quietly so everyone can pretend it didn't happen. He was memorizing. He stood there and he looked at the faces of the people who had done this thing and he filed each one carefully away the way a man does when he has learned that memory is sometimes the most powerful tool you have. Tiffany Miller, Derek Walsh, the two security officers, the airline's logo on the wall above the gate, the flight number, the time. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out his phone. Not a new phone, a plain unimpressive device that looked like it belonged to someone's grandfather, which it did. He scrolled to a contact listed simply as RJ and pressed call. It rang twice. Augustus. The voice on the other end was professional, measured awake even at this early hour. RJ, Augustus said. His voice was perfectly even. I need you to call the notes. A pause. Short, significant. All of them. Everything we hold in transatlantic, credit facilities, the bridge loan, the convertible notes, all of it. Call them now. Another pause. Longer this time. RJ was not a man given to dramatic reactions, but Augustus could hear something shift in his voice when he spoke again. Augustus, that's I know what it is, Augustus said. Do it. The market opens in 40. I know when the market opens, RJ called the notes. Yes, sir, RJ said, and the call ended. Augustus put the phone back in his pocket. He picked up his bag. He walked to the end of the jetway, found a bench near the gate, and sat down. He set his bag between his feet. He folded his hands on his lap. He waited. Around him, the terminal moved with its ordinary morning energy, travelers pulling rolling bags. Children half asleep against their parents' announcement cycling through gates. Nobody looked at the old man on the bench. Nobody gave him a second thought. Derek Walsh had already gone back to his other problems. Tiffany Miller was somewhere in the sky by now, probably pouring champagne for the people who actually belonged, as far as she was concerned. The plane pushed back from the gate at 7:43 in the morning. And at 7:44, in a glass-walled office 40 blocks away in Midtown Manhattan, a man named Raymond James pulled up his terminal and began making calls of his own. He called the lead bank first, then the secondary lenders. He spoke in the calm, direct language of high finance, which is a language that sounds boring until you understand what the words actually mean, and then it sounds like demolition. He referenced specific clause numbers in specific loan agreements, the kind of clauses that live in the fine print that nobody reads until somebody calls them. He was professional. He was precise. He was systematically dismantling in real time the financial scaffolding that held one of the largest airline operations in the Atlantic corridor together. Transatlantic Airways had $4 billion in debt structured across a complex web of credit facilities, convertible notes, and institutional loans. It was the kind of debt that looked manageable, even healthy by certain metrics, as long as everyone holding the paper agreed to keep holding it. The moment they didn't, the entire structure became something else entirely. At 7:51 in the morning, the first credit line was frozen. Back at the gate, Augustus King sat on his bench and watched the departures board. Flight 116 to London was listed as airborne. He watched the little plane icon on the screen tracking northeast over the Atlantic. Somewhere on that plane, Tiffany Miller was going about her morning. Derek Walsh was probably already on his next crisis. The businessman in 2B was probably asleep. Augustus took out his phone again and sent one text. 3 words to his daughter in London. On my way. He went to the ticket counter, showed his identification, and rebooked himself on the next available flight to London. He paid for it the same way he'd paid for the first one, quietly, with a card that looked unremarkable and carried no name that would mean anything to the young woman behind the counter. She thanked him and handed him his new boarding pass. He thanked her, and he meant it, because she had looked him in the eye when she said it, and in his experience, that was not always a given. He found a coffee shop in the terminal and ordered a plain black coffee and sat at a corner table. He drank it slowly. He watched the people moving past the window. He did not look at his phone again because there was nothing more to do. The mechanism had been set in motion. All it required now was time. And Augustus King had always been very good at time. What he was thinking about as he sat with his coffee in that ordinary terminal coffee shop was not money. It was not revenge. At least not in the hot, satisfying way people think about revenge. He was thinking about a morning 40 years ago when he had walked into a bank in Atlanta with a business plan and been told by a man half his age that he wasn't the kind of person they extended credit to. He had walked out of that bank and into the next one and the one after that. And after the 7th attempt, he had found someone willing to look at the numbers instead of at him. He had built what he built not because the world made it easy, but because he had understood early and completely that the world's assessment of him and the truth of him were two entirely different things, and only one of them mattered. He was thinking about the faces of his children when he'd finally gotten the first contract. The way Camille, who had been 7 years old, had done a small, solemn dance around the kitchen because she didn't quite understand what the papers meant. But she understood that her father was smiling in a way he hadn't been smiling before. He was thinking that Tiffany Miller had looked at him this morning and seen an old man in a worn coat who didn't belong, and that this was objectively the most expensive mistake she would ever make in her life. Not because he wanted to punish her. Exactly. But because systems that allow people to be treated that way, systems that reward it, that back it up with security officers and supervisors and the quiet complicity of an entire cabin of people who looked away, those systems needed to feel in precise and measurable terms what they had done. He finished his coffee. He checked the departures board. His flight boarded in 2 hours. He was going to London to see his daughter, and his daughter was fine and everything was going to be fine. Somewhere over the Atlantic at 35,000 feet, a flight attendant named Tiffany Miller had absolutely no idea that the world beneath her was already changing. The stock ticker for Transatlantic Airways had been flat when the market opened at 9:30. By 9:52, it had dropped 4%. By 10:157, the financial news channels had not yet caught up to the story. There was no story yet. Officially, just numbers moving in a direction they weren't supposed to be moving and the particular anxiety that spreads through trading floors when numbers do unexpected things. By the time Flight 116 hit its cruising altitude and the seatbelt signs clicked off, the people who paid attention to such things had begun making their own calls. And Augustus King sat in the coffee shop, ordered a second cup, and waited for his boarding announcement. He was not in a hurry. He never had been. He had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing a person can do, the thing that costs the least and pays the most, is to be exactly who you are without apology and let the world spend itself trying to convince you otherwise. He had spent 82 years being exactly who he was. And today, for the first time in a long time, he had let the world see what that actually meant. Raymond James had been in finance for 31 years. And in that time he had learned that the most dangerous calls were never the loud ones. The loud ones, the shouting, the threats, the ultimatums, those were theater. The quiet ones were the ones that actually moved the earth. The call he made at 7:44 that morning was the quietest call of his career. He started with Meridian Capital because Meridian held the largest single piece of Transatlantic's convertible debt, $640 million, structured in 2019 during an expansion that had looked at the time like a very good idea. The managing director there was a man named Paul Geddes, who answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting while RJ laid out what Augustus had authorized. When RJ finished, Paul Geddes was quiet for a moment. "He's serious," Paul said. "It wasn't a question. When has he ever not been?" RJ said. Another silence. "Then I'll need to loop in legal. You have the clause numbers. You know what they say. This isn't a negotiation, Paul. This is notification." The call lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. By the time RJ hung up, Paul Geddes was already on another line. RJ moved to the next call, then the next. He worked through his list the way Augustus had always taught him to work, methodically without emotion, one name at a time, because emotion in these situations was a luxury that cost money, and they were in the business of making money cost other people. By 8:22, 3 of Transatlantic's 7 major credit facilities had received formal notice of acceleration. 2 more were pending. The remaining 2 were held by institutions that would hear about the first 5 within the hour because that was how these things traveled. Not through official channels, not at first, but... The standby passenger in seat 2A pressed her face toward the window, trying to see what was happening outside. A man in row 4 said loudly, "Are you serious right now?" And his wife touched his arm and said nothing. At the front of the aircraft, behind the closed galley curtain, Tiffany Miller was standing very still while a man in a suit, not airline personnel, not ground crew, someone else spoke to her quietly. She had turned her phone on the moment the wheels touched the runway, which was slightly before regulations technically permitted because Marcus's warning had been sitting in her chest for the last 2 hours like something she'd swallowed wrong. The notifications had come all at once. That was the thing about airplane mode. It created this artificial silence, and then the silence broke and everything that had been accumulating on the other side came through at the same moment, and the effect was less like being informed and more like being hit. She had looked at the number of notifications and felt her legs go slightly uncertain. She had not yet read a single one when the man in the suit appeared and told her in a very calm and professional voice that she was to remain on the aircraft until further notice and that someone from the company's legal team would be speaking with her shortly. She looked at him. "Am I in trouble?" He looked at her with the careful neutrality of someone who has been trained not to answer that specific question. "Someone will be with you shortly," he said. In the cabin, the delay stretched past 5 minutes. Passengers who had been patient became impatient. A family in row 9 had a connection to catch, and the father was now standing despite the crew's request, his carry-on bag in hand, and nobody was stopping him because the crew was occupied with other things. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from inconvenience to something more unsettled. The particular anxiety of a group of people who sense that something is wrong and don't know what it is. Jenna Park in her seat near the back had her phone out. She was watching the notifications move. Her video 43 seconds she'd filmed almost without thinking. The way you film things when your brain hasn't yet caught up to the significance of what you're watching had become something she didn't have language for yet. She had done content for 4 years. She understood numbers, and the numbers on her screen were outside the frame of anything she'd ever seen. She was also reading the AP article and Carol Whitfield's piece and the comments, and she was beginning to understand in real time the full shape of what she had accidentally documented on a Tuesday morning at JFK. She typed a response to a DM from a major news outlet. They wanted to talk. She said yes and gave her number and put her phone down and looked at the seat back in front of her and took a breath. The door of the aircraft had not yet opened. Outside at the terminal, 2 things were happening simultaneously. The first was bureaucratic, the kind of official presence that manifests as men in dark jackets holding clipboards and having conversations just out of earshot. The presence that airports acquire when something has become a matter of record. The second was less official and more human, which is to say it was messier and louder and harder to control. There were journalists. Not many. Heathrow security had kept the main press group outside the terminal, but enough. Word had traveled through the channels that travel fastest when a story has momentum. And the story of Flight 116 and its morning at JFK had momentum that nothing was slowing down. Derek Walsh, the ground supervisor who had nodded at the security officers and watched Augustus King walk off the plane that morning, was currently in a room at JFK. Being interviewed by a woman from the airline's HR department. And a man he had never met before, who turned out to be an outside attorney. The interview was not going well for Derek Walsh. Not because the attorney was aggressive, he wasn't. He was perfectly professional, but because the answer to every question Derek Walsh gave pointed with meticulous and unavoidable clarity in the same direction. He had made the call. He had seen the ticket. He had proceeded anyway. He had no explanation for why that did not add up to what it added up to. He asked at one point, "Did I do something illegal?" The attorney looked at him. "That's being evaluated," he said. Derek Walsh was 38 years old and had 3 children and a mortgage, and had been with this company for 11 years, and had that morning made a decision in 4 minutes that he would spend the rest of his life explaining. He sat in that room and felt the specific weight of having been on the wrong side of something you can't undo, and it was heavier than he had imagined anything could be. Augustus King arrived at Heathrow Terminal 3 at 5:22 p.m. He had slept for most of the flight. Genuinely slept, not performed sleep, but the real kind, the unhurried rest of a man who had done what needed to be done, and had let it go for the moment. He woke when the plane began its descent, and looked out the window at the English countryside, coming up through the clouds, and he thought about Camille, and he stretched his neck to the left, and then the right, and he was fine. He came through arrivals with his small bag and his worn coat moving at his own pace. And Camille was there before he cleared the barrier. She was 39 years old and looked in this particular moment more like her mother than she usually did. The set of the jaw, the controlled precision of someone holding themselves together by will. She had her father's eyes, though, dark and patient and already seeing the thing behind the thing. She did not say anything at first. She just held him, her arms around his shoulders, her face pressed briefly against the collar of the coat she'd grown up watching him wear. He patted her back the way he always had, twice firm, the universal signal of "I'm here and I'm fine." "You should have called me," she said into his shoulder. "I am calling you," he said in person. She pulled back and looked at him. She was searching his face for something damaged, distress, the thing that a son or daughter always looks for in a parent's face after something has happened to them. She found something, but it wasn't what she expected. He looked, if anything, rested. "Dad," she said, "do you understand what's happening?" "I understand what I did," he said. "What's happening is a consequence of that. The stock." "I know the video has, I know, Camille. 22 million views," she said. "As of an hour ago," he looked at her steadily. "Then let's go somewhere and sit down," he said. "I haven't eaten since this morning." She took his bag from his hand and they walked out of the terminal together, and the cameras that were stationed outside caught them. An old man in a worn coat and a younger woman walking side by side, not hurrying. And the photograph that ran with the story in 17 publications the following morning was that one. Not the video, not the boardroom, not the stock ticker, just that a father and his daughter walking out of an airport going somewhere to eat. It was, several commentators would later note, the most effective press image of the year. And it was entirely accidental. They went to a small restaurant near Camille's gallery, the kind of place that has been there for 20 years and doesn't try to be anything other than what it is. They sat at a corner table and ordered food, and Camille watched her father eat with the appetite of a man who is, despite everything, fundamentally okay, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since she'd watched those 43 seconds on her assistant's phone. "Tell me what actually happened," she said. He told her all of it in order, without drama. The way he always told stories, as sequences of fact with the emotion underneath rather than on top. The gate, the boarding pass, Tiffany Miller's face when she looked at him, the words she'd said, the security officers, the jetway, RJ's voice on the phone, the coffee, the newspaper, the young man in the new suit. When he finished, Camille was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You called the notes before you even left the terminal?" "Yes, within minutes, yes." She looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between admiration and something that looked like grief. "Was it worth it?" He set his fork down. He looked at his daughter across the table, and he thought about how to answer that honestly. Not what sounded good, not what would make her feel better. The honest answer. "That flight," he said, "carries 400 people every week on that route alone. And everyone on it this morning watched what happened and nobody said a word." He paused. "Not one person." He picked his fork back up. "So yes, it was worth it, because if I had gotten up quietly and gone to coach and said nothing, the system that allowed that would have continued, and it would have done it again next week to someone else, to someone who didn't have the ability to make a call." Camille was quiet. "I am not interested in punishing Tiffany Miller," he said. "I am interested in making it very clear in the only language that system understands that what happened this morning has a cost." He ate. "It does now." His phone rang. He looked at the screen. "RJ. Excuse me," he said. He answered, "RJ. Ashworth's office has called 4 times. RJ said, "They're asking if 6 p.m. still works for the call." "Tell them 7, Augustus said. "Augustus 7, he said. "I'm having dinner with my daughter." He hung up. Camille was watching him with an expression. He recognized the one that meant she was deciding whether to say something. "Say it," he said. She paused. "What are you going to do with transatlantic? What's the actual plan?" He looked at her. "I'm going to give them a choice." He said they can restructure the debt under new terms that include binding equity commitments to retraining, policy overhaul and independent oversight, or they can default and I use the proceeds to build something better. Camille went still. You'd build an airline. I've been thinking about it for a while, he said with the calm of a man who has been thinking about it for exactly as long as he's been thinking about it and is not surprised to be saying it out loud. What happened this morning didn't start the idea, it finished it. She looked at him for a long time. You're 82 years old, Dad. I know how old I am. Building an airline it's what I do, he said simply. I build things. She picked up her wine glass. She looked at it. She set it down without drinking. Okay, she said with the particular tone of a person who is still processing but has decided to be in it anyway. Tell me. At 7:05, Augustus King excused himself from the table and walked to a quiet corner of the restaurant and called Richard Ashworth. Not his office, the man's direct line, which RJ had obtained with the specific efficiency that had made RJ for 31 years. It rang twice. Mr. King. Ashworth's voice was different from what it had been all day. Not collapsed. He wasn't the collapsing type, but recalibrated. The voice of a man who has spent an entire day doing the unpleasant work of understanding a situation he'd walked into badly and is now trying to walk back from with some dignity intact. Mr. Ashworth, Augustus said, I want to begin by saying, you don't need to begin anywhere. Augustus said not unkindly, I know what you want to say. I'd rather talk about what comes next. A beat. All right. All I'm going to give you two options, Augustus said. The first, you restructure the debt. New terms, longer maturity, lower rate. In exchange, your board commits to a binding policy overhaul, hiring, training, passenger protections with quarterly reporting to an independent oversight body of my choosing. You make a public statement of personal accountability that goes beyond legal language, and you make it clear specifically that what happened this morning is not a policy failure. It is a culture failure and you own it. Ashworth was quiet. And the second option, you default. Augustus said, I use whatever I recover to start something new. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Augustus could hear in the background what sounded like papers moving and possibly another voice. Grant Holloway, probably just off camera as always. What kind of something new? Ashworth said carefully. An airline, Augustus said, one with a different set of rules. The silence this time was even longer. Mr. King, Ashworth said finally, and his voice had changed again, the last layer of performance gone now, just a man on a phone call at the end of the worst day of his professional life, talking to the person who had caused it, and trying to find the geometry of a way forward. What happened this morning was wrong. I'm not going to hide behind policy language or operational complexity. What was done to you was wrong, and I'm sorry. Augustus said nothing. I want to be clear that this airline, at least the airline I intend it to be, does not want to be the institution that made that video possible. I don't know yet exactly how we became it, but I want to fix it. I know you do, Augustus said. That's why I called you back instead of calling a press conference. He paused. My attorney will send you revised terms in the morning. Read them, all of them, and if you're serious about what you just said, you'll sign them. He ended the call and stood in the quiet corner of the restaurant for a moment. Around him, the low, ordinary noise of people eating dinner, the clink of glasses, a table laughing about something, normal life proceeding normally. He looked at his phone. RJ had sent a text. Stock closed down 22.4%, at 4%. Investors calling all night, ready when you are. He texted back, morning is fine. Get some sleep. He walked back to his daughter's table and sat down. Camille looked at him. How did it go? He apologized. Augustus said, do you believe him? Augustus considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I believe he's scared, he said. Scared men sometimes do the right thing. We'll see. She nodded slowly. And if he doesn't sign? He looked at his daughter across the table, at the lights of London visible through the window behind her, at the life she had built in this city, that he had watched her build with the quiet pride of a man who understands that his greatest creation has always been the people he raised. Then he said, we build something better. Inside Heathrow, in a room that looked very much like the kind of room you don't choose to be in, Tiffany Miller sat across from a woman from the airline's legal team and a man from HR and a union representative who had arrived 30 minutes after the plane landed and had not yet spoken. The legal woman was named Christine, and she was professional and direct and gave nothing away in her face, which Tiffany had spent most of the last hour trying to read. They had gone through the morning chronologically. Tiffany had answered each question honestly because there was no other way to answer them. The video existed 43 seconds of her own voice and her own face, and there was nothing to contradict or contextualize, only to explain, and the explanation kept arriving at the same place no matter how she approached it. She had looked at him and decided before she verified. She had said what she said. She had called security. Was there any other basis for the removal? Christine asked for the second time. Behavior intoxication a security concern of any kind? No. Tiffany said the ticket was valid. Yes, he was in the correct seat. Yes. Christine wrote something. The union representative shifted in his seat. The HR man looked at the table. Ms. Miller, Christine said, and her voice dropped half a register. Not softer exactly, but more direct in the way that sometimes precedes a sentence. You will remember for the rest of your life. I want to ask you something and I want you to think before you answer, not for legal reasons, just because I think it matters. She paused. Why did you decide he didn't belong there? The room was very quiet. Tiffany looked at her hands. She had been answering questions for an hour. She had been careful and professional and sequential, and she had described the morning in the language of procedure. And that language had been steadily, methodically stripped away by the simplicity of the facts until there was nothing left but the real question, the one Christine was now asking. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. I looked at him, she said, and she stopped. I assumed. You assumed what? That the word got stuck. She made herself say it. That he didn't belong there because of how he looked. The union representative looked at the wall. Christine wrote it down. Tiffany looked at what had been written and felt for the first time all day. Not the fear of consequences, but the specific cold arrival of understanding. The kind that comes when you have spent a long time not looking at something. And then you look and you see it clearly. And you understand that you cannot unsee it. And that this moment of seeing is the thing you will carry. I'm sorry, she said. Not to Christine, not to the room, to something she couldn't see that was somewhere outside the room's walls, somewhere at 35,000 feet or on a terminal floor or in the memory of 82 years. Christine closed her folder. We'll take a short break, she said. And then we'll talk about what happens next. Outside the room, the airport moved with its evening energy flights. Arriving flights departing, thousands of people going to thousands of places. Each of them carrying a story that nobody else in the terminal would ever know. Somewhere in that terminal, a digital board showed flight arrivals and departures. And among them, the status of transatlantic Flight 116 had changed from arrived to a blank space that was being updated by systems talking to other systems. And the update when it came would not say what had actually happened on that flight because the systems didn't have language for it. But 22 million people did. The terms arrived in Richard Ashworth's inbox at 7:41 the following morning. 11 pages drafted by Augustus King's legal team with the kind of precision that told you immediately these were not negotiating documents. They were not written to be haggled over. They were written to be accepted or refused. And the language made clear that the people who wrote them understood exactly which of those two options the other side could actually afford. Grant Holloway read them first because Grant always read everything first. He was on his third coffee by the time he reached page 4. And by page 7, he had stopped underlining things and started circling them. And by page 11, he put the document down and called Ashworth directly. Have you read it? He said. I'm reading it now, Ashworth said. Page 9, the oversight clause. I see it. That's not a standard covenant structure, Richard. That's Grant paused, choosing his word. That's governance. I know what it is. He's asking for a seat at the table. Not equity, not a board position, an oversight chair, independent, reporting publicly every quarter. I know what he's asking for, Grant. Are you going to give it to him? Ashworth was quiet for long enough that Grant could hear the sound of a page turning. Then Ashworth said, we're down 22%. We have fuel suppliers on review. We have 3 institutional investors who called last night threatening to exit their equity positions. We have a video that has been viewed by he stopped. What's the count this morning? Grant looked at his phone. 31 million. The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that has weight. Then yes, Ashworth said, I'm going to give it to him. The board will do what makes sense.